We have to cancel tomorrow. Courtney is devastated about the Sephora deal falling through. We need to hold space for her grief right now. Please understand. That was the text my mother sent me at 11:51 p.m., less than 24 hours before my 18th birthday party, a party I had paid for myself. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just stood by the window and watched the catering van which I had booked 6 months ago pull out of the driveway. That was the moment the daughter they knew died. And the architect of their destruction was born. Before we get into the fallout, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. Have you ever had a big moment stolen by someone else's drama? I'd love to hear your story. To understand why I burned it all down, you have to understand the architecture of my family. We lived in Buckhead, Atlanta, in a house that looked like a wedding cake and felt like a museum. My parents, Jeffrey and Cynthia, didn't raise children, they curated assets. My sister Courtney, 26, was the show pony. She was an influencer with bot followers and a personality that required high-speed internet to function. I was Morgan, I was 20, and I was the shadow manager. I didn't just live there, I ran the operation. Since I was 14, I was the one who balanced the household budget because my father couldn't figure out Excel. I was the one who ghostwrote Courtney's college admission essays because she couldn't spell empathy without spell check. I managed my mother's social calendar, my father's medication schedule, and the damage control every time Courtney tweeted something offensive. The pay gap was laughable. Courtney received a monthly allowance of $6,500 to maintain her image. I received zero. I worked nights as a virtual assistant just to pay for my AP textbooks. When I asked for help with tuition, my father told me that struggle builds character. When Courtney wanted imported Italian furniture for her bedroom renovation, $18,000 worth, my mother called it an investment in her personal brand. You might wonder why I stayed, why I cleaned up their messes for 2 decades without screaming. For a long time, I thought I was just being a good daughter, but looking back, I realized it wasn't loyalty. It was survival. It is what psychologists call the fawn response. When you are raised in a house where love is conditional, you learn that your only value is your utility. I believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just fixed enough problems, if I just made myself indispensable, they would finally see me. I thought my labor was the rent I had to pay just to exist in their world. I was bound by an invisible chain, convinced that leaving them would mean I was nothing. I didn't realize that I wasn't the one who needed them. They were the ones who needed me. I was the load-bearing wall in a house of cards. So when I graduated valedictorian, I didn't ask them for a party. I planned it myself. I saved every penny. I invited the few friends I had, my teachers, the people who actually saw me. It was supposed to be my one day, the one day I wasn't the fixer, and then came the text. Courtney lost a brand deal, something minor, a hair vitamin sponsorship worth maybe $2,000, and suddenly my milestone was collateral damage. They weren't canceling a party. They were confirming a truth I had tried to ignore for 20 years. I didn't matter. My feelings were an inconvenience. My achievements were invisible, and my compliance, that was over. The morning of my birthday, the house was quiet. My parents had taken Courtney to a spa retreat an hour away to help her process her trauma. They left me a generic card on the counter with a $50 bill inside. No note, just the cash like a tip for good service. I stared at it for a moment, then added it to my stack. I didn't cry. I didn't scream into a pillow. I moved with surgical precision. I had spent the last 6 months secretly moving my most precious belongings into a storage unit just in case. Now I finished the job. I packed my clothes, my laptop, my diplomas, and the few sentimental items I had managed to keep hidden from Courtney's envy. I wiped my laptop, removing all the family budget spreadsheets, the password lists, and the contact databases I had built for my mother's social club. I left the house key on the kitchen counter right next to a single sheet of paper. On it, I had written a list of every password I had changed that morning: banking, email, social media, utilities. And at the bottom, I wrote one sentence: I am resigning from the position of daughter. I walked out the front door, locked it behind me, and got into my car. As I drove away from the manicured lawns of Buckhead, I didn't look back. I felt lighter, like gravity had suddenly released its hold on me. I drove straight to a studio apartment I had leased 3 weeks ago under a different name, a contingency plan I had hoped I wouldn't need. But as I unlocked the door to my empty, quiet space, I realized I didn't just need it, I deserved it. I wasn't running away, I was finally arriving. The first week my phone was silent. I suspect they were waiting for me to crawl back. In the narrative they had constructed, I was the ungrateful child. Throwing a tantrum in hunger or loneliness would eventually drive me home. They expected me to fail because they had never bothered to notice that I was the only one succeeding. They gave it 7 days. Then the ecosystem I had maintained for 6 years began to suffer system failure. It started small. The Wi-Fi at the estate went down. My father, Jeffrey, called me 3 times in a row. He didn't leave a voicemail, but I knew exactly what was happening. He didn't know the password. He called 3 times, no voicemail, classic Jeffrey. The man had survived 30 years in commercial real estate without ever learning to leave a coherent message. He operated on the assumption that his presence alone was communication enough. That the world would simply pause and wait for him to show up and explain himself in person, over a glass of bourbon at a time of his choosing. I watched the screen light up, watched it go dark. Watched it light up again. I didn't answer, not because I was angry. I want to be clear about that. Anger is hot, and what I felt in that apartment was the opposite of heat. It was room temperature. It was the particular calm of someone who has already made their decision and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. I poured myself a cup of coffee, real coffee. Not the watered-down pot my mother kept brewing because Courtney read somewhere that dark roast causes inflammation, and I sat at my second-hand kitchen table and I let the phone ring. The Wi-Fi. Password. For the record, was Courtney Queen B 2019, all one word, capital C, capital Q, capital B. My mother had chosen it. I had never once commented on that. I had changed it that morning to a randomized 16-character string that I had already deleted from my memory. That was day 7. By day 10, the landscaping service called me, not my parents, me. Because I was the one who had set up the automated payments, and I was the one listed as the account contact, because my father once told the crew to come back on a Tuesday when he meant a Thursday, and nobody showed up for 3 weeks, and the HOA sent a warning letter, and my mother cried for an afternoon, and somehow it became my responsibility to make sure that never happened again. I told the landscaping service very politely that they would need to speak with the homeowners directly. The woman on the phone paused. And who should we ask for, Jeffrey or Cynthia Whitmore? I said. They're the homeowners. Another pause, longer this time. We've only ever dealt with you. I know, I said. That's the problem. I hung up and finished my coffee. I want to tell you something about what those first 2 weeks actually looked like. Because I think there's a version of this story that gets romanticized in the retelling. The brave girl escapes her toxic family, moves into her own place, glows up, eats well, sleeps 8 hours, discovers herself, and some of that is true. But the honest version is messier. The apartment was small, 600 square feet, pre-furnished with pieces that had clearly survived at least 2 previous tenants and 1 small fire. The carpet had a stain near the window that I had covered with a rug I bought from a church sale for $4. The refrigerator made a sound at 2 a.m. that I can only describe as a refrigerator having second thoughts about its life choices. The upstairs neighbor, whoever they were, appeared to practice some kind of rhythmic stomping exercise at 7 in the morning with the dedication of someone training for a competition. I loved it. I loved every imperfect square foot of it, because here's the thing about silence, real silence, the kind that belongs to you. It sounds different than the silence in my parents' house. Their silence was loaded. It was the silence of a house waiting for someone to do something, waiting for the next crisis, the next spreadsheet, the next managed disaster. My silence was just silence. I could sit in it and not feel the pressure to fill it with usefulness. For the first 3 days, I barely left the apartment. I ate toast and eggs. I read a book I had bought 6 months earlier and never opened. I slept 8 hours, then 9, then 10, making up for years of running on 6 because there was always something to fix in the morning. On the 4th day, I cried. Not about them, about myself. About the version of me that had spent so long being useful that she had never quite figured out how to just be. I cried for about 40 minutes, which felt like the right amount. And then I washed my face and made dinner, and that was that. Now, let me tell you about the fallout, because that's what you're here for. My mother found a way to contact me on day 12. Not by calling my cell, I had set her number to go straight to voicemail, but by emailing my college advisor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, who had written me 3 recommendation letters and once told me I was the most organized mind she had encountered in 20 years of teaching. My mother sent Dr. Huang an email explaining that there had been a family misunderstanding and asking her to pass along a message urging me to come home. Dr. Huang forwarded it to me with a 2-word response of her own. She wrote, "Absolutely not." Asterisk. Then she sent me a separate email asking if I was okay and whether I needed any resources. I told her I was fine, thanked her, and that was the last either of us mentioned it. What I found interesting about my mother's approach was the framing. A asterisk family misunderstanding, not an acknowledgement of what had happened, not an apology, a reframe. Because in Cynthia Whitmore's world, everything that went wrong was either a misunderstanding or someone else's fault, and usually the someone else was me. She had a gift for retroactive revision. She could take any event, no matter how clear-cut, and reconstruct it until she was the reasonable party and I was the one who had overreacted. I had watched her do it to other people my whole life. Teachers, neighbors, the woman at her book club who once made an innocent comment about Courtney's eyebrows. My mother would absorb the incident, incubate it for anywhere from 48 hours to 3 weeks, and then produce a version of events so convincing that even the people who had been present sometimes doubted their own memories. It was a skill, honestly. I had inherited a version of it. The difference was that I used mine for problem solving. She used hers for self-preservation. I saved the forwarded email, not because I planned to use it. Just because documentation is a habit I developed early and I saw no reason to break it, Courtney reached out on day 15, I'll give her this. She was creative about it, she didn't text or call or email. She sent me a DM on an account I hadn't known she had, a secondary Instagram she apparently used to lurk on without announcing herself. The profile picture was a cartoon sun. The username was something innocuous, the kind of thing you'd never connect to a person unless you already knew. She had been watching my main account, which I hadn't touched since I left. And she found a comment I'd left on a friend's post 3 months earlier and traced it to a smaller account I used to follow independent bookstores. I want you to understand that I felt something close to professional respect when I figured out what she'd done. Courtney, for all her performative helplessness, was not stupid. She was skilled at exactly the things that required no accountability: social navigation, reading a room, finding the one unlocked window in a house where you've closed all the doors, the message read, I know you're not going to respond, but I wanted you to know I didn't ask them to cancel. I didn't know until after. For whatever that's worth, asterisk I read it 4 times, then I put my phone face down on the table and stared at the ceiling for a while. Here's the complicated truth about Courtney. She was spoiled, yes. She was enabled, yes. She had floated through life on a cushion of resources that had been in part subsidized by my invisible labor. But she was also the product of the same house I grew up in, just with a completely different assignment. Where I had been handed responsibility, she had been handed fragility. My parents had decided early, in that wordless way parents make decisions they never articulate, that Courtney was the one who needed protecting and I was the one who did the protecting. Neither of us had chosen our roles. Neither of us had been asked. The difference was that my role had made me capable, hers had made her dependent. I didn't respond that day or the next. On the 3rd day, I typed a reply, deleted it, typed a shorter one, deleted that too, and finally sent 3 words. Asterisk I believe you, asterisk not, asterisk it's okay, not I forgive you, not let's talk, asterisk just I believe you. Which was the truth and also a boundary and also the most I had to offer at that particular moment. She left a single heart react on the message and didn't respond further. The infrastructure collapse, as I came to think of it, happened in stages. Stage 1 was utilities. I had managed the automatic payments for the house since I was 16. After my father missed 3 consecutive bills and the electricity got cut during a dinner party my mother was hosting for her junior league chapter. The look on her face when the lights went out mid-appetizer was something I had filed away not as a memory but as a lesson. I set up the auto-pay that same week. I organized everything into a spreadsheet, color-coded by due date, with a secondary reminder system built into a shared calendar that only I ever checked. For 4 years, not a single bill had been late. I had disconnected myself from all of it the morning I left. I want to be precise about something here, because I've told this story to a few people and I always get the same question. Wasn't that cruel? Wasn't pulling the support systems out from under them deliberately vindictive? And my answer is always the same. I didn't pull anything out from under them. I stopped holding things up that were never mine to hold in the first place. There's a difference. If you've been carrying a wall on your back for 6 years and you finally set it down, you're not responsible for the wall falling. You're responsible for setting it down. The people who built the wall on a person's back instead of on a foundation, they're responsible for the falling. I had left every password on that sheet of paper, every single one. Internet banking, the HOA portal, the utility company logins, the streaming services, the alarm system, the landscaping account, the housekeeper's contact and payment schedule. Everything they needed was on that paper. I had been more thorough in my resignation than most people are in a 2 weeks notice letter. The problem was that my parents had never once engaged with any of these systems. In 6 years, they had not learned the name of their electricity provider. They did not know that the property taxes came out of a separate account I had helped set up during a refinancing situation my father had mishandled in 2021. They did not know that the housekeeper, a woman named Gloria who had worked for the family for 11 years, had my number saved as the emergency contact because the one time she'd tried to reach my mother about a broken vacuum. Cynthia had sent her to voicemail 4 times and then complained to my father that the help was becoming too demanding. They had a roadmap. They simply had never learned how to read one because I had always been the one driving. Stage 2 was social. My mother's social life was, to put it generously, a managed production. She was on the board of 2 charitable organizations, was an active member of her book club, and maintained a carefully cultivated network of women in the Buckhead social ecosystem whose approval she required the way other people require oxygen. I had been managing her calendar, drafting her correspondence, and occasionally ghostwriting her newsletter contributions for the Atlanta Children's Hospital Auxiliary for 2.5 years. The newsletter thing had started casually. She'd asked me to clean up an email she was sending to the auxiliary's membership chair, and I had, in the process of cleaning it up, essentially rewritten it from scratch. The membership chair had replied the same afternoon, calling it the most eloquent communication she'd received from any board member all year. My mother had forwarded the reply to me without comment, but she'd knocked on my door that same evening and asked if I could help with the next one too. That was how it always worked. I helped once. The help became expected. The expected became invisible. The invisible became mine to carry. I had scheduled her next newsletter contribution for the 2nd week after I left. The draft was not in her email. It was not in any shared folder. It existed only in a document on my laptop, which I had wiped clean. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon, not from her cell. From the house phone, a landline they kept in the kitchen that I think my father believed gave him a kind of old money gravitas. The area code showed up on my caller ID, and I knew immediately what it meant. She had either lost her phone, which had happened 3 times before, or she was deliberately calling from a number she thought I might not have blocked. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I know the exact length because I saved it, the same way I saved the forwarded email from Dr. Huang, the same way I document everything. The message began with a version of my name said in a tone I recognized immediately, the tone that was designed to sound wounded without technically making an accusation. It moved through a brief and strategically selective summary of recent family events, in which the birthday party cancellation was described as a difficult situation that everyone was still processing, and in which my departure was framed as a sudden and confusing decision that had left the whole family worried. It ended with a request for me to call back, followed by a pause, followed by the information that the auxiliary newsletter was due on Friday and that Patricia Chen, the membership chair, had already sent 2 reminder emails. She did not say I'm sorry. She did not say we were wrong. She did not acknowledge that she had left her younger daughter a $50 bill on the morning of her birthday and driven to a spa with her other daughter. What she said, right before she hung up, was, "We need you, Morgan. We've always needed you." I played that last line twice because she meant it as a plea, as the thing that would bring me back. She had identified the mechanism she believed controlled me, my need to be needed, and she had pulled it like a lever. What she didn't understand, what she had never understood, was that being needed and being valued are not the same thing. I had been needed for 20 years. A hammer is needed, a calculator is needed, a load-bearing wall is needed. That is not the same as being seen. That is not the same as being loved. I typed out the newsletter myself. Then I sat there and looked at it for a long moment, and then I closed the document without sending it. I need to tell you about a woman named Sandra Acaffer, because she matters to this story more than almost anyone else in it. Sandra was my neighbor in the studio apartment building, Unit 4B, directly across the hall from my 4A. She was 53 years old, originally from Lagos, had lived in Atlanta for 22 years, and worked as a night shift charge nurse at Piedmont, Atlanta. She wore her scrubs like armor, and she kept the kind of immaculate small apartment that told you everything about a person, that she had earned every square foot of her space, and she respected it. Accordingly, we met on my 2nd day. I was in the hallway attempting to wrestle a second-hand bookshelf through my doorframe at an angle that was, in retrospect, geometrically impossible. She came out of 4B, assessed the situation for approximately 4 seconds, and said in a tone that brooked no argument. You need to tilt it 30 degrees and lead with the left corner. I tilted it 30 degrees. I led with the left corner, it went right through. She nodded once like a surgeon confirming a diagnosis and went back inside. We didn't exchange names that day. We exchanged names the following week when she knocked on my door to ask if I had a can opener she could borrow, and I had one. And she came in and saw my kitchen table covered in color-coded study materials for the CLEP exams I was preparing to take, and she looked at everything laid out and she said, "How old are you?" I told her I was 18. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been taking care of people for a long time, haven't you?" I didn't ask how she knew. Some things are visible to people who have lived enough to recognize the signs. The hyperorganization, the contingency planning, the instinct to make yourself small and useful simultaneously. Sandra had spent 30 years in nursing, and before that she had been the eldest daughter in a family of 6 in Lagos. Which meant she had her own particular understanding of invisible labor and what it does to a person's nervous system over time. We had dinner together that Friday. She made jollof rice and fried plantains, and I contributed a grocery store rotisserie chicken, and the kind of honesty that only comes out when you are sitting across from someone who has absolutely no stake in your family drama. I told her the whole story, not a curated version, the real one. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Did you ever grieve it?" I didn't understand the question. The family you deserved, she said, not the one you had. The one a child like you should have had. Did you ever stop and grieve that? I stared at my plate. Because there's a version of this, she continued, where you spend the next 10 years being proud of how efficiently you got out. And you never actually mourn what you lost. And that catches up with you. I've seen it. I thought about the 40 minutes I had cried on day 4, whether that counted, probably not, I decided. Sandra became, over the following weeks, the closest thing I had to a stable adult presence in my life. She wasn't maternal in the conventional sense. She didn't soften things or offer comfort in the form of platitudes. What she offered was honesty, consistency. And the occasional plate of food left outside my door when she got home at 6 in the morning, and could tell from the light under my door that I had been up all night studying. She also, about 3 weeks into our friendship, said something that reframed the entire way I had been thinking about my situation. We were talking about my parents, about the ongoing ecosystem collapse, and I was describing it with, I'll admit, a certain amount of clinical satisfaction. The Wi-Fi, the newsletter, the landscaping, the tax situation that I suspected was going to surface within the next 2 months like a slow-moving iceberg. And Sandra looked at me and said, "You know the goal isn't to watch them fail, right?" I said I knew that. Does it feel like you know that? I thought about it honestly. Not entirely, I said. That's fair, she said. You're allowed to feel satisfied that the systems you built stopped working without you. That's just confirmation that you were real, that your work was real. But if you build your recovery on their collapse, you're still tied to them. You're just standing on the other end of the rope. I wrote that down in my notebook that night. I still have it. You're still tied to them. You're just standing on the other end of the rope. The tax situation surfaced on day 31. I know the exact day because I had marked it in my calendar 3 weeks earlier, when I'd calculated roughly how long it would take my father to realize that the property tax installment, which was due on the 1st of the following month, had been set up on an auto draft from a checking account that I had been managing and that he had not, to my knowledge, looked at directly since the Obama administration. Jeffrey called my cell at 9 in the morning. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, voicemail. Then he did something he had never once done in my memory. He texted. My father texted the way a person types who learned on a typewriter and never fully trusted the transition. Every message was a complete sentence, capitalized properly, punctuated, Morgan. Your father here, there seems to be a matter with the house accounts that requires your attention. Please call when convenient. I read it 3 times. Your father here, as if I might have forgotten who he was, as if I might have multiple fathers who could be texting me about house accounts at 9 in the morning. I didn't call when convenient. I called my own accountant instead, a woman named Reese who I had found through a college financial aid resource center and who charged me a sliding scale rate that I could actually afford. I asked her to walk me through what my continued involvement or lack thereof in my parents' finances meant for me legally. The answer was nothing. I had never been on any of the accounts officially. I had managed everything as a de facto administrator, but there was no legal obligation, no signed agreement, nothing that tied my labor to any contractual responsibility. I was free and clear. I texted my father back that afternoon, one sentence: "You'll want to contact a financial advisor or your bank directly. I'm no longer available for family administrative matters." He did not respond for 6 hours. When he did, the message was longer than anything he had sent me in recent memory. "Morgan, I want you to understand that what you are doing is causing real harm to this family. Your mother is upset. Courtney is dealing with her own difficulties. We are all struggling, and this is not the time for whatever point you are trying to make. I have always provided for this family, and I expect the same respect I have given. Please come home and we can discuss this like adults." I read it once. I didn't feel the heat of anger. I felt something quieter and more permanent. Because that message was, in its way, a perfect encapsulation of everything. I have always provided for this family. He believed that. He genuinely believed that financial provision was the whole of parental responsibility, that because he had paid the mortgage and kept the lights on, the accounting was balanced. The invisible labor, the emotional management, the years of administrative work performed by his teenage daughter, none of that registered as provision. It registered as background noise. The hum of a house that simply ran. He didn't see me. He saw a function that had stopped functioning. I saved the message, added it to the folder. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the CLEP exam registration portal and signed up for 2 more tests. I passed both CLEP exams on the first attempt: American Literature and Financial Accounting. 42 college credits total, earned over 6 weeks. Sitting at my $4 church sale rug-covered kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the particular focus that comes from having absolutely nothing else competing for your attention. No family calendar to manage, no Courtney crisis to absorb, no father's medication schedule to track. Just me and the material and the quiet refrigerator that had, by this point, resolved its existential crisis and settled into a reliable hum. I want to talk about what it felt like to study for myself. Not for a grade that would impress someone. Not for the valedictorian title that my parents had mentioned exactly once, in passing. At a dinner where they spent the majority of the conversation discussing Courtney's upcoming brand trip to Scottsdale. Just for me. For the actual acquisition of knowledge that I actually wanted, it felt, and I recognize this is going to sound dramatic, like drinking water after a very long time of being told you weren't thirsty. I had always been academically capable. That part wasn't new. What was new was the absence of the secondary calculation I had always run alongside my studying, the one that measured how my success would land at home. Whether my achievements would be acknowledged or quietly resented, whether doing well would make me more valuable or more threatening. Courtney had dropped out of her first college after a semester, transferring to a school with a lower academic bar and a better Instagram aesthetic. And after that, my mother had developed a habit of framing my academic performance in ways that were technically complimentary but tonally careful. "Morgan's very studious," she would say at social gatherings, in the voice someone uses to describe a child who is well-behaved but not exciting. As opposed to Courtney, whose ongoing content creation was described as *building something real, I had internalized that calibration more deeply than I realized. There was a version of me that had been quietly dimming the wattage on my own ambition for years, keeping it functional but not blinding, useful but not inconvenient. In that apartment, for the first time, I turned it all the way up. I mapped out a 2-year plan. With the CLEP credits, I could enter Georgia State as a sophomore, potentially a junior depending on how the transfer evaluations went. I was interested in finance. Not in the abstract sense, but in the specific and personal sense of someone who had been managing a household budget since 14 and wanted to understand the machinery behind the numbers she'd been operating on instinct. I wanted to understand why the system worked the way it did, who built it, who it served, and how to use it with intention rather than just necessity. Sandra, when I showed her my 2-year plan, looked at it for a long moment and then said, "You forgot to put meals in here." I looked at the schedule. She was right. I had blocked out every hour of every day with study blocks, work shifts. I had picked up 2 more virtual assistant clients by this point and administrative tasks. And I had not scheduled a single meal, a single walk, a single hour of unstructured time. "Old habits," I said. "Yeah, *, she said. "We're going to work on that." Sandra had a way of saying we * that didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like an anchor. Like someone standing on the shore holding a rope while you figure out how far out you can swim. Week 6 was when Courtney came to the apartment. I hadn't told anyone in my family where I was living. My phone was on a new plan I'd opened independently, and my new address was registered to a P.O. box I'd set up for exactly this reason. I had been careful, methodical. I had not underestimated them. But I had, it turned out, slightly underestimated Courtney. She found me the way she found everything she wanted but wasn't supposed to have, through social engineering. She had called my college advisor's office, not Dr. Huang but the general advising office, posing as a potential transfer student asking about resources for students who had recently relocated. She'd gotten a name of an off-campus housing resource center from a well-meaning administrative assistant. From there, through a combination of charm and strategic vagueness, she had gotten the general neighborhood. From the neighborhood, she had used the fact that I had paid my deposit via money order, something she knew I did from watching me manage finances for years, to narrow down which complexes accepted them. She'd spent an afternoon driving slowly through 3 different parking lots looking for my car. I found this out later. At the time, what I knew was that there was a knock on my door on a Tuesday evening at around 7 o'clock, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw my sister standing in the hallway in a camel-colored coat and sunglasses, which she was wearing indoors and in the evening. Because Courtney had a personal brand to maintain even in low-stakes environments. I stood at the door for a long moment, then I opened it. She looked different without the context of the house around her, smaller somehow. Not physically, Courtney was 5'8" and had the posture of someone who had been photographed enough to make it automatic, but dimensionally. Like a piece of furniture that looks enormous in a showroom and oddly modest once it's in a real room with real proportions. She looked at my apartment, at the church sale rug, at the stack of textbooks on the table, at the single set of dishes drying next to the sink. She didn't say anything condescending. That surprised me. What she said was, "You actually did it," not an accusation, not a performance, just something that sounded underneath the carefully maintained surface like something close to awe. "Yeah, asterisk," I said. "I did," I let her in. I made tea because it was something to do with my hands, and because the ritual of making tea had always helped me think, and I needed to think clearly about what this visit was and what it wasn't. She sat at my kitchen table. She looked at my 2-year plan, which was still pinned to the wall above the table because I had not yet bought a proper board and was using the wall as one. She didn't comment on it for a while. Neither of us said anything. Then Courtney said, "They're really struggling, Morgan." I poured the tea, set her cup in front of her, sat down across from her. "I know," I said. "Dad hired someone to help with the accounts, some financial services company. They charged him $800 for an initial consultation and then told him everything was fine, which it isn't. Because the property tax account is apparently underfunded, and there's some kind of automatic transfer that stopped." And Courtney, I said. She stopped. "I know," I said again. "I'm not going to fix it." She wrapped both hands around her mug. She had her mother's hands, long-fingered and expressive. "I'm not asking you to fix it," she said. And then, quieter, "I don't think I'm supposed to be asking you to fix things anymore." I looked at her. "I've been in therapy," she said. "Since about 2 weeks after you left. Dr. Alston, it's been a lot." This was not something I had expected. Courtney had always met the suggestion of therapy with the particular resistance of someone who understood, on some level, that genuine self-examination might destabilize the architecture of her current life. She preferred managed feelings that had been filtered through aesthetics and repackaged as content. "What made you go?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then Dr. Alston asked me in our first session to describe a time when I felt genuinely proud of something I had done, something I had actually done myself without help. She paused. I sat there for 45 minutes and I couldn't think of one. The apartment was very quiet. "That scared me," she said. I didn't say anything. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is not fill the silence they need to sit in. "I've been thinking about the essays," she said eventually. She meant the college admission essays, the ones I had ghostwritten when I was 15. "I got into that school because of your words. I got the Sephora deal, the first one, the real one, 2 years ago because of a pitch deck you helped me build. I've been thinking about how much of what people think of as me is actually you." She said it with a flatness that was new, not the performed vulnerability she usually deployed. "Something rawer than that. That's not entirely true," I said. "The camera loves you. That's not something I gave you. The camera loves a performance," she said. "You gave me the script." I didn't argue with that. "I'm not trying to guilt you," she said quickly, "or pull you back. Dr. Alston has been very clear that I'm not here to do that. I think I came because I needed to see that you were okay, that you were actually okay, not performing okay the way you always did." She looked around the apartment again, at the books, at the wall plan, at the $4 rug. You seem okay, I said. And for the first time in the 6 weeks since I'd left, I said it without calculating whether it was true. It just was. She finished her tea. She didn't stay long. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame and turned back. For what it's worth, she said, you deserved the party. You deserved all of it, I nodded. I didn't say it's okay. I didn't say it doesn't matter anymore because it did matter. It always would. Some things don't stop mattering just because you've survived them. I know, I said. Thank you, she left. I stood in the doorway and listened to her heels on the hallway floor, the elevator, and then silence. Then I went back to my kitchen table and I sat down and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not the family chaos, not the system failures, not the logistics. Just the grief of it. Two sisters in their 20s sitting across a kitchen table with mugs of tea, finally speaking a language they should have been allowed to speak for years. In a small apartment, the younger one had had to build herself from nothing because no one had ever thought to build it for her. I cried for about 20 minutes that time, which felt like progress. I need to tell you what happened with my father, because that's the part of the story most people want to know about, and it's also the part I've taken the longest to figure out how to tell. My father called me on a Saturday morning about 8 weeks after I left. Not the performative Saturday morning calls he used to make from the kitchen while reading the journal. The ones where he'd ask me a single logistical question and then hang up feeling like he'd checked the box of paternal engagement. This was different. He called at 7:45 a.m., which meant he'd been awake for a while before he dialed. He let it ring long enough that I almost sent it to voicemail on reflex. Then something made me answer. Morgan asterisk, he said, just my name, no real estate voice, no Bourbon and Country Club authority. Just my name in a register I didn't recognize from him, which was lower and quieter and older than the voice I knew. Hi, Dad. A long pause. On his end, I could hear the kitchen. The particular acoustics of that kitchen, the way the sound bounced off the marble countertops, the distant hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator that I had once scheduled a service call for. I had grown up in the sound of that kitchen. It moved through me with the strange physical weight of something you've absorbed so deep it lives in your body rather than your memory. I wanted to call, he said, and then stopped. Started again. I've been trying to figure out what to say. I didn't help him. That was intentional. The old version of me would have filled the pause, would have offered him an easier path into the conversation, a gentler landing strip. I sat with it. I found the spreadsheet asterisk, he said finally. The full one. I had the financial services company dig through everything and they found the master file you must have backed up on the home server. 7 years of records. Everything. Another pause. Morgan, I didn't know the scope of it. I knew you helped. I didn't know it was everything. I was quiet. The accountant said that the organizational system you'd built was more sophisticated than what most small business offices run. He wanted to know who had set it up. I told him my daughter, a pause that had something heavy in it. He asked how old you were when you started. I told him 16. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said that was remarkable. Secondhand acknowledgement filtered through a stranger's professional assessment. This was how my father operated. He needed the external validation to triangulate his own response. He could not simply look at his daughter and see what was there. He needed someone else to point at it first. I knew that. I had known it for years. I had stopped blaming him for it somewhere around week 3 in the apartment, when I'd had enough quiet to understand that my father was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was a man who had never been taught to look directly at the people in his life. He'd been raised to provide and to perform and to keep a certain emotional distance that he had probably been told, in some indirect generational way, was dignity. He had passed his limitations to his children the way parents always do, not deliberately but inevitably, the way you pass a cold across a breakfast table without meaning to. That didn't make it okay, it just made it human. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. Your mother wants me to ask you that, but I told her that I wasn't going to do that. A long breath. I want to say that I'm sorry, Morgan. For what it's worth coming from me at this point, I'm sorry that we let you carry what you carried. I'm sorry about the birthday. I'm sorry that we spent 20 years treating you like a resource instead of a daughter. The kitchen hum on his end, the refrigerator hum on mine. I sat with his apology for a long moment. Not performing consideration, actually considering it. Here is the thing about apologies, the right ones don't erase anything. They don't reach back through time and fix the thing that happened. They don't rebuild the party that was canceled or restore the years of unpaid labor or hand back the childhood that got spent managing other people's lives. What a real apology does, if it's real, is it changes what happens next. It's not a debt settlement, it's a declaration of understanding. It says, I see now what I couldn't see before. That's all it says. What you do with that information is still entirely up to you. Thank you, Dad asterisk I said, not I forgive you, not it's okay, not we're fine, just thank you for saying it. For meaning it enough to be this uncomfortable on a Saturday morning at 7:45. For being, at 61 years old, in the kitchen of the house you built on your children's invisible labor, willing to say the word sorry to the daughter who finally stopped holding everything up. It was a start. I didn't know what it was the start of, but it was something that hadn't existed before and that mattered. I'm going to be okay, Dad asterisk I said. I want you to know that. He made a sound that I think was him trying not to cry, which was something I had never once seen my father do, and which I filed away with the particular tenderness you reserve for the unexpected moments when people show you they are more than you knew. I know you are asterisk he said, you always were. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes without saying much. Then we said goodbye and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after, watching the morning come through the window. Thinking about what it means to put something down that you've been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. Georgia State sent my acceptance letter on a Thursday afternoon in October. I was at work when it came through. Sitting in the corner of a coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment with my laptop, and a cold brew I had been nursing for 2 hours because the coffee shop had good Wi-Fi and I had learned to make a single drink last an entire work session without feeling guilty about it. I had 2 virtual assistant clients by then, a third I was onboarding, and I had started picking up freelance bookkeeping work through a referral from Reese, my accountant, who had started sending small business clients my way when their needs were simple enough that they didn't require a full CPA, but complex enough that they needed someone who actually knew what they were doing. The email subject line said, "Congratulations on your admission to Georgia State University." I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop, sat back in my chair, and looked out the window at the street for a long moment. A woman walked past with a stroller. A delivery driver double-parked and sprinted into a building with a stack of boxes. A group of students from the high school 2 blocks over moved in that particular formation of teenagers who are performing nonchalance for each other's benefit. I thought about the version of me that had stood at a window at 17, watching a catering van pull out of a driveway. I thought about how that girl had believed, in some wordless and foundational way, that her life was something that happened to her. That the people around her were the ones with agency, and she was the variable that adjusted itself to accommodate whatever they needed. That her wants were a secondary system, something to be addressed once the primary systems were stable, which they never were, which meant her wants never quite made it to the front of the line. I thought about how long it takes to unlearn that, how it doesn't happen in a single moment of decision or a single morning of packing your belongings into a car. How it happens in the small, accumulated choices that come after, answering the phone when your father calls or not, opening the door for your sister or not, signing up for the exams, making the 2-year plan, putting meals on the schedule when Sandra points out that you forgot to feed yourself again. I thought about all of that. Then I opened my laptop back up and texted Sandra. I got in. Her response came 40 seconds later, which meant she was awake even though she'd worked a night shift and should have been sleeping. "Of course you did. Dinner tonight. I'm making egusi soup." Don't argue. I didn't argue. I moved into the Georgia State area the following January. Not the dorms. I was past the age and the financial logic of dorms, and I had built enough of a client base that I could manage rent on a slightly larger place. A 1-bedroom in a building that did not have a mysteriously philosophical refrigerator, but did have better natural light and a small balcony where I put a single chair and a plant that I was determined not to kill. The plant's name was Jeffrey. I want to be clear that I named the plant after my father in a spirit of affection rather than spite, mostly. He was a resilient species that required periodic attention and did not respond well to being ignored for long stretches. The metaphor felt honest. Sandra helped me move. She brought her car and a neighbor from her building named Terrence who owned a truck and asked for nothing in return except that we feed him, which we did. And who turned out to be one of those people who could fit any arrangement of furniture through any doorway through what appeared to be a combination of spatial reasoning and sheer force of will. In 3 hours the apartment was done. Sandra stood in the middle of my new living room. She looked at the bookshelf, a real one purchased from an actual furniture store with actual money I had earned. Not hauled sideways through a door frame, and the desk I had set up by the window and the plant on the balcony. "This looks like somewhere a person lives asterisk," she said. "That was the goal," I said. She hugged me, which Sandra did not do frequently and therefore meant something when she did. I held on for a moment longer than I usually hold on to things. I should tell you where everyone ended up because I know that's what you're waiting for. My mother enrolled in an organizational management class at the local community center sometime around month 4 after I left. I know this not because she told me directly, but because Courtney mentioned it in one of our bi-weekly texts, which had become the primary channel through which my sister and I were slowly and carefully beginning to rebuild something. The class was not a professional course. It was the kind of thing offered on Tuesday evenings in a church multi-purpose room by a retired office manager who charged $40 for a 6-week session, but my mother went every Tuesday for 6 weeks, and then she took the intermediate session. Courtney told me that their mother had reorganized the kitchen and was managing her own calendar for the first time and had told Courtney, apparently without irony, that she hadn't realized how much work went into keeping a household running smoothly. I sat with that information for a long time before deciding how I felt about it. What I landed on was this: I didn't need her to fully understand. Full understanding, the kind that encompasses 20 years of accumulated invisible labor and its specific costs to a specific child, was probably beyond what she was capable of at this stage and possibly at any stage. What I needed for my own peace was not her complete comprehension. It was my own. I had that. She was working with what she had. That would have to be enough. We spoke on the phone for the first time in month 5, 23 minutes. She didn't apologize directly in the way my father had. What she did was talk about the household management class, and in talking about it, she revealed layer by layer that she was understanding for the first time in a practical and immediate sense what it had taken to run the life she had simply inhabited. She didn't name me in the acknowledgement, but it was there. I could hear it between the lines of what she was saying, in the slight change in register when she got close to it and then moved carefully past. It wasn't the conversation I had deserved years ago. But it was real, and it was more than I had expected, and I chose to receive it for what it was. My father hired a bookkeeping service and a property manager and a personal assistant on a part-time basis. He paid them real money, actual market rates, for the work I had been doing for free, which told me something I had suspected but never had confirmed in dollar terms. He and I spoke every 2 weeks or so, short calls. He asked about school, I asked about the house. We were learning how to be in each other's lives in a way that was smaller and truer than what we'd had before, which had been large and completely false. Smaller and truer was better. It was something we could both stand on. He sent me a birthday card in February, handwritten, not generic. He had clearly labored over it. The handwriting was careful in the way of someone not used to writing by hand, every letter a small, deliberate act. He wrote that he was proud of me. That he had always been proud of me, even when he had not known how to say it or had not made the space to say it or had been, in his words, too busy looking at the wrong things. He wrote, "You have your grandfather's mind." He could see around corners. I should have told you that a long time ago. I have never met my grandfather. He died before I was born. But I kept the card in the front of my notebook, the one where I write things down that I want to remember. Courtney's therapy, it turned out, was not a phase. This is the part of the story that surprised me most, if I am being honest. I had expected the therapy to last a few months, to produce some softening around the edges, and then to be quietly discontinued when the discomfort of genuine self-examination outweighed the social currency of being able to say you were working on yourself. I had underestimated my sister in a different direction than my parents had. She went deep. I don't know all of what happened in those sessions because that is hers, not mine. And one of the things I have been learning this year is that my sister's interior life is not mine to manage or narrate. What I know is the external evidence. She started posting less. Not stopping entirely, because her income still depended on her platform in some measure, but pulling back from the performative vulnerability that had been her primary content mode. The aesthetic grief and the managed candor that looked like openness, but was actually a very sophisticated form of control. She started posting about things that were actually true, small things, real things, the therapy, the process of understanding her own dependency. A series she started tentatively, called *Learning to Do It Myself, which was about exactly what it sounded like and which resonated with people in a way that her carefully curated previous content never had. She lost some followers in the transition. She told me this without apparent distress. The ones who leave when you get real, she said, weren't really there anyway. I thought that was one of the most insightful things I had ever heard my sister say. I told her so. She laughed and said Dr. Alston had said it first, but she was working on generating her own insights and she'd get back to me. We had lunch together for the first time in month 7. A restaurant she chose, somewhere in Midtown, nothing performative about it. We sat across from each other and ordered food and talked for 2.5 hours, and it was, without qualification, the best conversation I had ever had with my sister. Not because everything was resolved, it wasn't. Not because the history was repaired, it couldn't be, not completely, not quickly. But because for the first time we were two actual people sitting across a table, rather than two assigned roles, maintaining a dynamic that served neither of us. She said something toward the end of lunch that I keep coming back to. She said, "I used to think you were the responsible one and I was the creative one, like those were fixed things. Like we'd been sorted and that was it." She pushed her food around for a moment. "I think Mom and Dad did that to us. Made us into the thing they needed rather than letting us figure out what we were." I agreed with that. "What are you?" she asked. Not rhetorically, actually curious. I thought about it. "I don't entirely know yet, asterisk," I said. "I'm working on finding out." She nodded. "Me too." We split the check. That felt important. We split it exactly down the middle and neither of us commented on it, but we both knew what it meant. Here is what I know at 19 years old. Having burned down one life and built another one in a 600 square foot apartment with a church sale rug and a philosophically troubled refrigerator. I know that the fawn response I talked about at the beginning of this, the survival mechanism that tells you your only value is your utility, does not dissolve simply because you remove yourself from the environment that created it. It lives in your nervous system. It shows up in the instinct to over-explain, to preemptively accommodate, to make yourself smaller in spaces where you have every right to take up room. Recovery from that pattern is not a single act of leaving, it's a practice. It's catching yourself about to offer help you don't have to offer and asking whether you want to offer it or whether the old circuitry is just running on reflex. It's learning the difference between generosity and preemptive self-erasure. It's a process that I am actively in the middle of and expect to be in for some time. I know that forgiveness is not a destination you arrive at. It is something closer to a decision you keep making in different forms as new information surfaces. I forgave my parents in the sense that I released the version of the story where they were purely villains, because that version, while emotionally satisfying, was not accurate and was keeping me tied to a narrative that centered them when the story I needed to be living was mine. That is different from saying what they did was okay. It wasn't. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and I have made my peace with the complexity. I know that the people who see you clearly are rarely the ones who raised you. They are the neighbor across the hall who tells you to tilt the bookshelf 30 degrees. They are the college advisor who responds to your mother's manipulation with 2 words. They are the people who have no stake in your old story and therefore have every ability to respond to the new one you're writing. I know that rebuilding after you've been someone else's infrastructure for most of your life is slower and stranger than anyone tells you. There are whole weeks where I feel solid and purposeful and capable of the life I'm building. There are other weeks where I wake up at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark and feel the particular cold of someone who has stepped away from a system that depended on her and is not yet sure whether the new system, the one built around her own needs and wants and future, is strong enough to hold. Sandra says that's normal. Sandra says the cold patches are part of the process, and the fact that I can identify them as cold patches rather than permanent climate is evidence that I'm doing better than I know. I believe her. I'm working on believing myself. My sophomore year at Georgia State starts in August. I've declared a finance major with a concentration in financial planning, which is a very logical extension of being the girl who balanced a household budget at 14 and has complicated feelings about it. I have 3 clients now, steady ones, and a 4th in conversations. I have a 1-bedroom apartment with good light and a balcony. I have a plant named Jeffrey who is doing well, which I choose to read as a positive sign about everyone involved. I have a sister who is becoming, slowly and imperfectly, and at the pace that genuine change actually moves, someone I might one day call a friend. I have a father who writes letters by hand now. Not often, but sometimes. I have a mother who is learning, at 55, to manage her own calendar, which is a smaller thing than what she owes me and also the only thing she knows how to give right now. And I am learning to receive what people can give rather than grieve what they can't. I have Sandra, who left a container of soup outside my door last Tuesday when I had an exam and who has somehow, without either of us formally acknowledging it, become the model of what a person who has survived hard things and kept their own character intact can look like at 53. I hope I look something like her at 53. That is not nothing, that is actually quite a lot, and I have this, whatever this is. This story I've been telling you from wherever you're listening, in whatever car or kitchen or quiet corner of your own complicated life. I started telling it because I needed to say it out loud in order to make sure I understood the shape of it. That is also, I suspect, why you've been listening. Because most of us, at some level, know what it is to be the load-bearing wall, to be the one who holds things up while pretending to simply be part of the structure. To have the value of your presence only fully register in its absence. To wonder in the small hours of some ordinary morning whether the people in your life love you or simply need the functions you perform. The answer, when it comes, is rarely all one thing. People are complicated, families are complicated. The ones who failed you were often failed themselves, in different ways, in different rooms, in different decades. And understanding that is not the same as excusing it, but it does make it possible to carry the story without being crushed by it. What I can tell you, from the specific coordinates of my own life, is that there is a version of things where you stop being what other people needed you to be and start finding out what you actually are. It is inconvenient and uncomfortable, and there are weeks when the cold comes at 3 in the morning and you lie in it until it passes, but it passes. And in the daylight, in the good weeks. In the coffee shop with the cold brew and the open laptop and the acceptance letter, in the apartment with the good light and the balcony chair, and the plant that is still alive in the hallway of building in Atlanta where a woman across the hall tells you to tilt 30 degrees and lead with the left corner, in all of those places. The thing I feel most is free. Not the freedom of having nothing, the harder kind, the freedom of having chosen everything that's mine. I am Morgan, I was the shadow, I was the load-bearing wall, now I am the architect. And I'm just getting started. Thank you for listening. If any part of this story landed for you, drop a comment, tell me where you're hearing this from. Tell me about the weight you've been carrying, or the weight you've put down, or the weight you're still deciding what to do with. I read every single one, and if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who's been holding everything up while pretending it doesn't cost them anything, send it to them. Sometimes the most important thing someone can hear is that the door is already unlocked. I'll see you next time.